Hello, everyone, and welcome to the RPO Leadership Forum webinar series from the Recruitment Process Outsourcing Association. In today's webinar, we are talking about implementation. In particular, best practices for successfully implementing an external partnership. Our speakers are Zach Coffey, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, and Chris Fox, Vice President of Implementation at Hueman. Hueman is a leading national people solutions organization and a gold member of the RPOA. In addition, it's my pleasure to also announce that Joe Marino, Chief Operating Officer at Hueman, recently joined the RPOA Advisory Board. So with that, welcome, Zach and Chris. I'll pass it over to you to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And I am monitoring the chat, so I get to interview in a way. I dubbed Chris Fox the nicest person in the world. So I get to interview the nicest person in the world today and talk to her about implementation. But if you have questions or anything you want to chat about, please put it in the chat. We're going to see it and we're going to make sure that we get through everything. So Chris, I guess we should probably go through some introductions. How about that?
Absolutely. So besides being the nicest person in the world, as mentioned, the Vice President of Implementation here at Hueman. I've spent the last almost 20 years focused on operational management, support, project management, business intelligence, account management, and really spent the last few years in our implementation here, really focusing on how to make that a great experience. I think a lot of people that join the webinar today are doing that because they've probably had some bad experiences. And so our goal is to make sure that is not the case. So today we're going to share some of those best practices we've learned, and really excited. This is a passion of mine, so honored to be here with all of you.
Thanks, Chris. Chris, if you want to advance a slide, probably a couple of slides here.
Yeah.
So I'll give my intro. Listen, I always make the joke. We'll send this out to you, and if anybody wants to print it out and keep a picture of us on your desk, you're more than welcome. You don't have to, but we'll send it to you just in case. So my name is Zach Coffey. My fancy title is Vice President of Strategic Partnerships. I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I've been with Hueman for a little over 8 years, and I had a unique experience in the fact that I started with our organization actually as a recruiter. And I remember my first day on the job working with a new partner and how smooth everything was. And I realize now, after spending time on the solution side of things, that the reason it was so smooth was because of what we did throughout implementation and developing a playbook and doing special things that when a new recruiter comes on board, they're ready to go. And it was due in large part to the work that Chris and her team do. Chris, if you'll click one more time. So just a little bit about us. Lamise mentioned we do a lot of this. So we made about 40,000 hires last year on behalf of our partners. And we worked with, we work at any time with over 50 RPO partners. And so that means we're implementing a lot. We're bringing on a lot of new partners, and we do it with a mid-sized organization. So a little over 400 employees. We're based in the US. Chris is in Jacksonville Beach. We have an Albuquerque, New Mexico office as well. But the biggest thing that I want to point out here is we are a people-first organization. And what that means is that we bring people that fit with our core values, and they are teamwork-oriented, customer service-oriented, and they're gritty. We continue to win awards for engagement. And what we really look for, as in my role, is working with organizations to say, how can we dedicate people to the effort? And take a look at 5 key main areas. So that is the people, your process, your technology, recruitment marketing, and then reporting. And we feel that if we elevate each of these 5 areas to really being a top functioning organization in each of those 5 areas, then you'll have a world-class talent acquisition organization. So my first question really is to Chris. How do you start to build and really set a foundation for a great implementation? I see the 5 things that I mentioned there, so I'll let you take it and extend it.
Yeah, so one of the most important things when we're starting an implementation is really that knowledge transfer. So what the journey that this new partner has been on with our solutions team with Zach and his teammates, just really understanding what got us to this point. Why did they decide to make this decision? What are their pain points? Really going through the agreement, understanding KPIs, SLAs, expectations around timelines, just really immersing ourselves in them as a partner before we even kick things off. And so that also helps us configure the project plan. So that is something that's extremely important to us. We are extremely flexible when it comes to supporting our new partnerships with really making sure that we're hitting on their specific needs and priorities. But we do have a structured approach by using a project plan, but we configure that to meet our clients' expectations. So that's something that's really important. And we kick that off at the beginning, and that's just something that we constantly are referencing throughout the process. And that also helps us bring the right people together inside our business to make sure that we're all aligned on how to best support this new partner over the next several weeks. And this also helps us plan what that kickoff meeting is going to look like and making sure we have the right external individuals on that call as well. One of the most important factors for me is to understand, are there going to be members on this kickoff that have not been part of the process so far? So we need to educate them on Hueman, and why we're here and make sure that they feel good about this partnership. Or are we just going to be working with individuals that know all about us and are just ready to roll up the sleeves and get started?
Awesome. Thanks,
Yeah.
Chris. So really starting with these 5 key areas and diving into each of them. What are the things, and I see you have slides up, so this is great. So when we think about a successful implementation,
Yeah.
what makes it successful and how would you define that?
So I believe that the relationship begins before the contract is signed. I think we know that. And so, um, making sure that our new partner feels very confident with their decision is one of the most important things that we want to experience. And to do that properly is to present them with a detailed timeline that's specific to them, and that project plan that I referenced earlier. But we just want to make sure that we've had clients, we all have clients where they're saying things like, well, that's what sales said, but we'll see what really happens. And that's the worst possible thing to hear. So we want to make sure that that confidence remains throughout that period. The other really important piece is making sure that we clearly define what those objectives and expectations should be. So making sure we're aligned from the very beginning is extremely important to us. So we don't want to be thinking that we're doing something and then they're having a different expectation. So understanding those expectations and communicating those is really important. Documentation and planning together. Things are going to happen throughout the implementation that's going to knock us off a little bit. We want to roll with the punches. We want to lean into that and not be afraid to be nimble throughout this process. You can still do that in a structured way. Effective communication is also extremely important. So meeting frequently, having those reoccurring meetings where you know you're going to be able to get together and keep things moving in the right direction, monitoring and evaluating your progress as well. So the slides that we have up here are really specific, and this is actually something that we present to our new partners very early on in our implementation process. And it just really helps set those expectations with them on what we need from them. And so outside of that task list that we're going to share with them of things that we need, we also want to make sure we have some of these more feel good items covered. So actively participating in implementation. So showing up to the meetings, answering questions, asking questions. Love it when you're on camera. That's really important to us because we really feel connected. And also helping us with that critical piece of change management. And so when we're building out our project plan, we take into consideration that this is going to be a change for our partner. And even if they're excited and prepared, it's still a change. And so putting some intentional tasks and milestones in our project plan to really lean into that change management piece is something that we find very effective. And so, bringing people involved in the process. So encouraging recruiters to join calls, any internal subject matter experts, being part of that process together so we can learn how to work together. And then we also like to include our recruitment teams on our implementation calls as well. We feel like it helps them learn more organically about their new client, but also gives us an opportunity to really build something together in a collaborative way. And also open and consistent feedback. So if something's not going well, we want to know about it and we want to make sure that we're communicating that frequently and just inviting that feedback, even if it's not something we want to hear. We don't want to start the relationship and service recovery before we've even started recruiting. So that's something that we find extremely important as well. And then just defining success. What does success look like? And that comes down to making sure that we're all aligned on processes. If we've made some changes to make things more efficient, we want to make sure that we roll that out properly, and just setting the right expectations. A lot of times, our partners have other things going on, believe it or not, besides just us. And so we want to respect that. And so just really figuring out where we're going to fit in into this process and how we can remain a priority, but also respecting the millions of other things that they have going on as well.
So, something you mentioned early on there was that alignment between, what was sold to them
Yeah,
and what we're actually going to be delivering on. You do an amazing job of that and making sure that those expectations are really set. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your role in sort of a project management perspective and how you handle that pushback, why it's important to have someone that is the implementation lead.
sure. So I'm going to actually progress to this next slide because I think this is really important and it kind of piggybacks off the change management piece we were talking about. But I think as an effective project manager for this type of implementation, you have to balance being structured and really focused. So things like making sure due dates are met, and having to remind people that we need to get these things done. And so sometimes being that annoying voice, but for the greater good of the project. So you're balancing that, but also being empathetic with the fact that they are going through change. And so the way that like I always look at this slide to kind of really help frame my mind as we're going into a new partnership is remembering that these two things are extremely important when it comes to having a successful implementation. So balancing the change management piece with the project management piece as well. And so one of the most important things as a project manager that you can do in these types of situations is make sure that that project plan comes up when you're having your weekly meetings. Now, I believe it's important to not overwhelm people. So I'm not going to pull up our hundreds of line items in our project management platform that we use. But I am going to pull up the things that they are responsible for and maybe highlight a few key areas that the human team is focused on so that they kind of know what we're doing behind the scenes. And so just giving them more bite-sized pieces over the next week. What are the most important things that we need to do? Having a status document that's a higher level, more of an executive summary, is also important. So if we have busy people, which typically we do, they can count on that weekly report out to know exactly where we stand and just take that simple red, yellow, green approach. And then if anything is off track or in a red status, discussing what that path to green looks like is also a really important part of the process. So, hey, we got off track, we are behind schedule, but let's talk about how to get back on track. And usually we're able to do that because we're on top of it. We can actually see things that might be at risk that could be trending towards that red status. And how do we bring it back to a green status together? And that could be changing expectations, that could be making it a priority, pulling in different people. There's a lot of different areas, but that's something we would discuss collaboratively. So, those are some of the more important components when it comes to managing these implementations, treating it like a project, but also this is a partnership. So that collaboration, reading the room, I could not get more excited when we have an audience that I can tell are hungry for some good jokes. So I am guilty of trying to get some good energy and laughter on our calls. Sometimes I'm more successful than others, but usually I can count on a good story about my 7-year-old son to get people loosened up a little bit. So,
Perfect.
yeah,
So you talked about change management and what you do from really a project management perspective, but you obviously have to have support from folks on the other end to make this
yeah.
a partnership. Talk to me a little bit about the key players from partner organizations and how they impact and what they're responsible for throughout implementation.
Sure. So I'm going to actually progress to this next slide here. And one thing I'll say that's really helpful to our partnerships when we're looking at our project plan is helping them see too, like where some of the things that they're responsible for are dependent on other tasks or can be blockers. And so being able to show them a visual of this has to be done here. And if this doesn't get done, this affects all these other items. And so helping them see that bigger picture in more of a visual format, we tend to find to be very helpful for them. Um, because we can't forget we do this all the time, they don't. And so want to make sure that they get the opportunity to understand that process as well. But very early on, we want to establish those key roles in implementation. And so we come at them with here's your implementation leader. It could be me, it could be someone else on our team, and what our role is going to look like. We want to establish those similar roles with our client as well. So here's an example of what we feel like are really important roles to make implementation successful. So we have the project sponsor role. So this is going to be that key decision maker, that one person that we can go to at the end of the day if we're at a crossroads, or that we want to provide that weekly executive summary to if they can't make all the calls. But this person is extremely critical. And I can tell you some of our more challenging implementations have been because someone was not in this role or didn't really own this role like we needed them to, because there are decisions that have to be made. The implementation lead is going to be what we call my best friend, the person that I'm probably going to work with the closest. If I don't know who to go to for what, maybe I'm not quite sure who needs to attend certain meetings, maybe I need some documentation or something, this is the person that I know I can go to, and we're going to be speaking the same language. And we're both very invested in keeping things moving in the right direction. And so, really, my primary point of contact on our client side. Doesn't mean the person that's doing all the work, just really helping facilitate that. So we have those key roles aligned. And then also the implementation team members. And so these are most commonly subject matter experts. So those individuals inside the organization that either currently do the process or have some role in the current process. Maybe they have a passion for process improvement inside the business. They want to be a part of something. But these roles can vary depending on the topic in whatever meeting we're in. So if we're talking about selecting candidates. They could be a different person than when we're doing like maybe a marketing overview, which, it could be different when we're talking about their applicant tracking system. So we really, when we're doing our timeline and presenting it, showing those key meetings that we're going to have throughout the timeline will also help them decide who should be in what meetings. And then we kind of help facilitate when those are going to take place.
So if you're looking at this and you're thinking, I'm going to implement an RPO, it can feel overwhelming, right? That it's going to be a lot of work for me. So talk to me like I am a talent acquisition leader and I'm going to be implementing this. How much work is it actually going to take from me personally?
Yeah, so if we answer that specific on these roles here, what I typically say is the project sponsor ideally is on our weekly calls. And so typically those are going to be about an hour a week. And for a standard implementation where it's a pretty standard scope, we're not implementing technologies and things like that, we can usually work together to knock that out in about 6 weeks. And so over the span of that timeline, if you can commit to about an hour to 2 hours a week, that is ideal. For our implementation lead, I like to tell them to plan for 2 to 3 hours a week, especially for the first 3 weeks. And that just, there's a lot of things that we have to pull together to really understand their business, their culture, how to talk to candidates and the market, all of those great things. So for the first 3 weeks, it's a little heavier, and then things kind of calm down a little bit as far as time commitments go. And then the subject matter experts depends on how many those are, but I would say at least an hour a week for that role as well. And so we take on as much of the work as possible and minimize as much as we can. Anything that we just can't do is what we're going to ask for our partnerships. And so when we do ask something in implementation, we actually will come with a plan and resources and examples. So, for example, maybe there's some training pieces that need to be done. We need to understand a little bit more about the business. And so we'll give you a list of here are different examples of things that we find is helpful to understand: core values, culture, tenure, things like that, that they can really come and sit down with us to help us better understand that as well. So try to minimize the amount of work, but it is something that has to be prioritized over that kind of 6-week period.
Awesome. Thank you. So Chris, I'm looking ahead and I see your deck. So I have some example, or you have some examples of great
Yeah, I
implementations and not
do.
so great implementations. And I know you're good for a story. So let's
Yeah.
get stories.
So I think, again, as I said earlier, I think a lot of people probably are interested in this call, not just for Zach and I, we know, but because you've probably been a part of an implementation that didn't feel great, felt clunky, or maybe wasn't successful, or you knew could be better. And so we are constantly improving and learning. So I think that that is a great message. Every implementation is different. The kind of the foundation is the same, but being able to roll with the punches and be a little bit nimble is actually something that we truly lean into. Um, but there's still structure. So what makes a great implementation is a lot of stuff we've been talking about today: engagement from the key players, being realistic with timelines and deliverables, having those dedicated recurring meetings. Another great piece is a formal handoff to our delivery team. So after implementation, we go live and we start recruiting. We don't want to start the learning process at that point. We want to start the recruiting process at that point. And so that implementation period is to get our recruiters as prepared as possible to hit the ground running at go live. And in order to do that, we want to take that 6, 8 week, whatever that time period was leading up to that point, and give them a really great guide to support them through that. And so that starts with an assessment. Are we really ready? A readiness assessment to go live and make sure that we're all feeling good about it. And then how does that translate into from that point forward? And what does our involvement continue to look like through that transition? Staying true to the project plan. Transitioning to implementations that have not gone as well is getting pressure from our partners to skip over steps, or they don't understand why it's important, so maybe we shouldn't do it. And sometimes that can be hard to push back on a new partner to say, trust me, it's in your best interest, and convincing them to trust you early on in the relationship, but really helping them understand why it's important and why this is something that we need to do. And so we've had scenarios like that where I knew that they did not agree, but they were willing to give me the opportunity to move forward with the plan. And, going back and looking at it, I think they would agree it's the right decision. And we've had situations where I should have fought harder and didn't. That's another lesson learned. And in those scenarios, we kind of beat that up during our retrospective. So after we complete an implementation, bringing all the key players back internally to say what went well, what didn't go well, any shout outs with our teammates that maybe went above and beyond that we want to try to replicate in the future. But really just owning that, and then remembering next time we really do need to hold strong to our project plan. Not having the decision maker, I mentioned that. I'm going to keep saying that because it's such an important factor, to make sure we have that one person involved and very passionate about making sure this is a success. Also mentioned earlier, but overwhelming your partner with a lot of tasks. I never show our clients all the things that we're working on. I'll show them milestones and highlights of things we're focused on, but I don't want to overwhelm them, and I don't want them to say, Chris, line 50 through 100, like, when do I need to have this done? I don't want them to worry about anything that they don't have to do. And I don't also want them to use that as look at all the stuff we're doing for you. I want them to look at this like they do this all the time. They're professionals, and feel really good about it. So I think that's really important, is to not overwhelm your client. A timeline is great. A visual is great. Key focus areas over the next several weeks is great, but showing them all that detail tends to be overwhelming. Now, if someone said, "I'd love to see it," then that would probably be my best friend. We sit down and have some coffee together and look through the project plan, but most people don't have time for that, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Um,
Awesome.
yeah, so those are the key areas, and then, of course, all these other things that we've talked about.
Yeah, so the biggest takeaways for me are really setting a plan, showing consistency, showing the value in it, and then from a solution side to a handoff to implementation to a handoff to operations. I think having those clear handoff points, consistent points, and making sure that we're all operating on the same page,
Yep.
it ensures a great partnership experience, not just a vendor relationship.
Yep.
Chris, we have a couple of minutes left. Any parting words, and then we can jump to some questions.
Yeah, I think just to piggyback off of what you were saying about the alignment piece, is one thing that we feel helps with that is we have our external client-facing meetings every week, but we also have internal pulse meetings every week. And so it's, how do we feel internally? What do we want to make sure we cover on this agenda? And so just really leaning into that communication and making sure everyone feels really good. So that's kind of one way to do that, and having more formal transition meetings at the beginning, and then one at the end as well. So, and then up here, just these are just a recap of everything we've mentioned. But you can see it's just, these are the key areas, and if you can come close to mastering these, implementation is going to be a much better experience for most people.
Chris, thank you so much for spending time and going through all of this. I see some questions popping up in the chat, and then Lamise,
Yeah.
you may have a couple questions for us. So we'll reserve a couple minutes. What can we answer for folks?
Yes, thank you. And do you have some kudos there in the chat, Zach? I don't know if you want to
You,
share
Stephen.
those.
We appreciate it. Just he can attest to our company culture and implementation processes being great, and we appreciate it. We hope that you see our culture and who we are all the time, and then that's what happens when you bring great people like Chris. We have a great process, and you look like you know what you're doing.
Absolutely. And
That's
as a
cool.
partner with Hueman, the RPOA, we've been in partnership for a few years, and I can attest to that culture as well. I do want to give you a couple of questions here and take more from the audience. One of the common, frequently asked questions around implementation is, what is the quickest and realistic timeline for implementing an RPO partnership?
So that's a very popular question, especially from Zach and his team. So everyone wants to go quick, and we do too. We get that. We're excited as well. And so really it's about balancing um, being responsible with what we need to get done so that we can be successful, but also respecting the fact that people want to move now that they've made a decision. So it is highly dependent on our partner's ability to prioritize this. So do they have competing priorities? And if they do, how do we manage that? But also the scope, if technology is being implemented or not, the size of the team. I mean, there's a lot of factors, but a good average that we can say generically is we can usually get things up and running in about 6 weeks.
Very good. And the next question is, why does an RPO need to know about what the organization is doing?
Yes. So that's something that comes up from time to time. So one of our early meetings in implementation is a process discovery meeting. And this meeting is 100% focused on understanding current state. And that's part of the value mapping process that we believe strongly in. And so step one is understanding current state. How do you all currently operate today? It really helps us understand if there's any like company policies or procedures that we have to honor. It also helps us understand what hiring managers may have come to love and require. So it helps us with that change management piece. What's going to be the most impactful, and then once we have that meeting, then we come together internally and really come up with ideas. What are some best practices? Maybe changing the order of things. A heavy focus on the candidate experience, of course, and making sure that that's being taken into consideration. And then we want to come back and build what a great best practice process looks like that we can all work on together. And that's going to involve creating a visual process flow to make sure that we're all aligned on what that looks like, especially those key handoffs. So when it comes to scheduling interviews or making offers, things like that is really important. So current state is so important to us. Also, if we're trying to go live in 6 weeks, sometimes we do have to go live a little bit in current state still, and then use maybe post go live to make some of those changes because, again, we want to make some changes if it's going to be what's best, but we have to respect all the people involved, and we don't want to delay our ability to help make hires while we're working on that. So that's something we take into consideration.
And Lamise, I did see a question come in the chat, and it was where a buyer is 100% bought in on the service, but then we face pushback as we get down the line from other stakeholders within the organization. I will say that is so important to have that internal champion, that person that is sponsoring what's coming in, to go back and explain the strategic vision to some of those stakeholders within the organization. Here's why I'm bringing them in. Here's maybe what some of your concerns might be and why it shouldn't be a concern. And Chris, anything to add that outside of that sponsor there?
No, that's just such a key role in that as well. Yeah.
A follow-up on that question, in terms of you said identifying a champion early on is important. How do you handle situations where internally there might be more than one champion, or you come in thinking that there is one, and then you discover there is conflicting internal leadership?
Yeah, so yes, this happens. This is reality. And so something that I always keep in the back of my mind, and I think again, this is where being nimble and flexible in these implementations is important because we may not know that, and then we get a couple meetings in, and so if we see that there may be a challenge with having maybe two decision makers or maybe they're not aligned on what the priorities are, I think taking a step back and acknowledging that and being open and honest of, this is going to be an issue for us. If anyone's familiar with RACI, responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, that's something that I think about a lot when I'm doing projects. And so you can only have one person accountable for something, right? There's a reason for that, and it's for this. And so sometimes it's about introducing a RACI into our implementation, saying, hey, we're going to have to make a decision. And it could be splitting out different areas of implementation. So maybe it's requisitions through screening can go to this person. So it's being flexible, but also just not shying away from having that tough conversation to say this could be a problem.
Thank you. And a lot of this sounds easy, but I know when it comes to execution, that is where the
Yes.
difficulty and the real skills, these leadership and management skills come through. And I can tell Chris both speaks the implementation and have strong execution skills. Zach, what do you think? We have a few more questions. You guys want to take some of these?
This one, I'd be happy to answer this one offline, just about candidate experience and ghosting and all of those things.
Yeah, that's a big
But
one.
Lamise, I think maybe back to you. I know that you
Well,
usually.
and Zach, real quick, I want to make sure Brandon asked a question in the chat. I want to make
Missed
sure
that one. Apologies.
About the buyer, but when you get into implementation, you face pushback from the other individuals. And I feel like we've touched on it a little bit, but I want to just maybe take a quick second to speak to that a little bit because this is also extremely common. And so I think this is where that change management piece comes in that we've talked about a few times. And so the more you involve these individuals, the better. But you still need that sponsor at that top level that we were kind of top down level that we were talking about. But inviting them into the process, encouraging that decision maker to let them be in the process, build the process together, and just really collaborate is one of the best ways to handle that. But at the end of the day, what we always say is when we make hires, all of that goes away. If we perform like we're supposed to, a lot of those concerns about bringing us in completely go away. And so we have to perform at the end of the day. And so that's something we'll constantly tell them is we get it. We ask for you to give us some trust here, but really communicating with them as much as possible helps.
So I'll take this one other question, and Chris, I feel like you answered this, but maybe we'll do a quick recap. So establishing buy-in from the client is important. How do you establish this trust with the client during implementation so you have the opportunity to do the job that you were hired to do?
Yeah. So I think the best way to establish trust is to make sure a lot of the things we've talked about, but making sure that that transition from sales to implementation, we do that the right way. And so we understand what are the conversations been like, Zach? Like you've bonded with this person, you've won the opportunity, you've said all the things that they wanted to hear, and how can I make sure that they quickly know that that's all going to happen? And so also creating opportunities to build trust. And so showing them that you have a timeline that's specific to them. So it's not nothing's generic. We may start off with a foundation, but that is built for our clients specifically. So showing them that we hear you, we've talked about it. I've looked through your contract. I've maybe in many cases met you before you even signed the agreement because you were a little unsure about implementation. And so just making sure that immediately they're seeing what they need to see to know that they made the right decision, and exposing them to as much as possible with, here's what we're doing, here's your team of recruiters, as soon as possible we want to introduce them, but showing them how prepared we are usually helps tremendously.
Well, I want to add, Chris, is something you also shared, which is the communication and the cadence of communication with
Yeah.
all these different stakeholders. It's not
Yeah.
just a one time and then they don't hear from you for the
Right.
different implementation. So the constant communication with all the different stakeholders, I would
Yeah.
expect that builds trust as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that, and multiple ways to communicate. So I think we know communication's hard. I take the 7 ways to communicate approach to most things: email, chat, text, phone calls. There's all these different ways. If it's important, you have to not just do one way. So the executive summary gives them a high level overview of how things are going. There's one that maybe gets them to a little bit more detail. And then you have your weekly reoccurring meetings that are on the books every week. You know you're going to get together, and then just check-ins along the way.
Well, thank you. And I know we're going over time, but let's just finish with this last question. What is the best way to balance building the client relationship, but also staying on pace and track to get the task completed?
Yeah, so I will say, again, a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, but those spoon feeding them, these are things that we need to do this week, and then start thinking about, that's something I'll say in like a recap of here's the task that we talked about we need to accomplish in the next week. Start thinking about X, Y, and Z. So it's almost like a preview. They don't have to do it yet, but that can help tremendously as well. And something that my teammate Mecca says a lot, and I believe another one of our teammates, Richard, used to say it a lot, but implementation doesn't happen to you, it happens for you. And so we just constantly think about that, and making sure that we are also building a relationship in this process. So I feel like I get very bonded with our new partners during this period. I get a little bummed when it's over, and then I get really excited to see what happens after we go live, and if we're able to be successful, like I know we will be. And so that's just really exciting. But I think building a relationship just naturally happens because they're counting on you and you're counting on them, to be successful. They've made an investment and you want to make them happy with their investment. But there's definitely a lot of bonding that happens. So, and I think just knowing your audience, reading the room is a really important piece of that as well.
Fantastic. As someone who used to implement technology for customers in a previous life, I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation today, and I could tell you're both passionate about
Yeah.
implementation as well. So thank you so much for sharing all these best practices with us and our RPOA audience.
Yep.
Awesome. Thanks for
Absolutely our
having us.
pleasure.
Yeah.
So if I can take a quick 2 last minutes to share a few announcements from the RPOA, since we might have some new audience as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and tell you about the RPOA. First of all, we are a mission-driven and member-driven organization serving the global RPO ecosystem and striving to be the place to go for RPO. We're the largest and most engaged community of talent acquisition professionals with a focus on recruitment process outsourcing. We offer platforms like this webinar to educate the marketplace about RPO in particular and talent acquisition trends and best practices in general. Today's webinar presented by Hueman, a gold member of the RPO Association. Our corporate membership provides learning and networking opportunities, thought leadership, and brand recognition for member companies. Please contact me if you're interested in exploring corporate membership, and you can find that information on our website. We invite you to get to know us better by joining the RPOA community membership, attending webinars, and our annual conference, which will take place in Chicago, October 6th through 8th this year. Registration is now open. We'd love to see you there. You can find upcoming events and tons of free quality educational content on the RPOA website. I also want to mention the one of the training that we offer is an RPO workshop. You heard about implementation today. We cover implementation, but we cover tons of other content and topics on RPO for those who provide RPO. So look on the RPOA website for upcoming sessions for the RPO workshop offered by Kim Davis. Here are some upcoming events. You can find them on the website. Also, if you haven't seen the RPO Trends Report, I highly encourage finding that on the website. You will also get the link to download a free copy in your follow-up email. With that, I do want to thank all of our participants and thank our speakers. Thank you so much, Chris and Zach. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome.
Thank
Thanks. We appreciate it.
Have a great rest of your week and look forward to seeing you on a future RPOA webinar.